Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're not just exploring a hair color, we're uncovering one of the most quietly misunderstood traits in human history: red hair. Something rare, something that has followed humanity for thousands of years, shaped by a small variation in the MC1R gene, and yet, for so long, it was never truly seen for what it is. Instead, it became a story, a symbol, something people admired in one place and feared in another. Something that was once linked to mystery, to difference, even to suspicion, not because of what it actually was, but because of how humans tried to explain what they did not yet understand. And tonight, we're going to slow down and gently uncover the truth behind it. Not just the science, not just the history, but the quiet pattern beneath it all. How a simple biological variation, shaped by light, by environment, by survival itself, slowly became something much larger, through perception, through belief, through time, and what that reveals about the way we still see difference even today. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and imagine somewhere in the quiet background of human history, a small genetic change, barely visible, quietly shaping the way light touches the human body. And without realizing it, that single variation would carry a story far greater than itself. I'm not entirely sure when I first noticed it, only that it stayed with me longer than it should have. A small detail, easy to ignore, and yet somehow impossible to forget. It wasn't a dramatic moment, nothing that demanded attention, just a quiet observation, the kind that slips into your thoughts without asking and lingers there, gently, almost patiently. I remember seeing someone standing among a group of others. Nothing unusual at first glance, same posture, same stillness, same presence. And yet there was something subtly different. Their hair, not dark, not light in the way I was used to, but something warmer, deeper, almost glowing in the soft light around them. Red, not bright or exaggerated, not striking in a way that calls attention, but quietly distinct, like a detail that doesn't belong to the rest and yet fits perfectly within it. And what stayed with me wasn't just the color, it was the way people seemed to notice it, even when they didn't say anything. A brief glance, a second look, a subtle shift in attention, nothing obvious, nothing unkind, but something present. And I began to wonder, not about the color itself, but about the feeling around it. Why does something so small create such a quiet sense of difference? Why does something as simple as hair carry a weight we don't fully explain? At first, I thought it was just curiosity, the kind we feel toward anything rare, anything we don't see often. But the more I paid attention, the more I realized it wasn't just curiosity. There was something deeper, something older, something that seemed to exist beneath the surface of the moment itself. Because this wasn't new, people have noticed red hair for centuries, and not always gently. There were times long before we understood anything about genetics, when red hair was seen as unusual, something suspicious, even something dangerous. In parts of medieval Europe, it was quietly associated with witchcraft, with unpredictability, with something that didn't quite belong to the natural order people believed in. Not because there was evidence, but because it was different. And difference has always had a strange effect on the human mind. We notice it, we question it, and sometimes we fear it. I sat with that thought for a while, letting it unfold slowly, without trying to rush toward an explanation, because it felt like there was something more beneath it, something that wasn't just about history or culture or even perception, something quieter. Why do we create stories about things we don't understand? Why do we attach meaning to something as simple as a variation in appearance? And more importantly, how often are those stories wrong? Because the truth, when you begin to look at it more closely, is often much simpler than the explanations we build around it. Red hair, as it turns out, is not a mystery in the way people once believed. It is not a sign, not a symbol, not an indication of anything beyond what it is. It is the result of a small genetic variation, something deep within the human body, something quiet, precise, and completely natural. A gene known as MC1R. Not powerful, not dramatic, not even particularly rare in the way we might imagine, just different. And yet, that difference was enough to shape stories, beliefs, even fear, across generations of people who had no way of understanding it. And I began to wonder, gently, without judgment, how many things in our lives are still like that? How many ideas, how many assumptions, how many quiet beliefs we carry are built not on truth, but on the simple fact that something felt unfamiliar? Because when we don't understand something, we don't always wait for clarity. We fill the space with meaning. And over time, that meaning begins to feel real, even when it isn't. I let that thought settle slowly without forcing it into a conclusion, because it wasn't just about red hair anymore. It was about something much broader, something more human. The way we see each other, the way we respond to difference, the quiet assumptions we carry without ever fully examining where they came from. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't expected, that this wasn't just a story about a rare trait or a genetic variation hidden within the body. It was a story about perception, about misunderstanding, about how easily something simple can become something else entirely, just because we never took the time to look at it clearly. And that was when the question appeared, quietly, almost naturally. What if the story we've been told was never really the truth at all? I didn't rush to answer that question because something about it felt too quiet, too delicate to be turned into a conclusion too quickly. So instead, I stayed with it, the way you stay with a thought that feels incomplete, but important. What if the story we've been told was never really the truth at all? At first, I tried to look at it the way I usually would, searching for facts, for explanations, for something clear and certain, something that could replace the uncertainty with understanding. And in a way, those answers do exist. The science is there. The explanation is simple. Red hair is the result of a variation in a gene, something known as MC1R, a small change deep within the body affecting how pigment is produced, how color appears, how light interacts with something as ordinary as hair and skin. It's not mystical, it's not dangerous, it's not even particularly complex, and yet that simple explanation feels almost too small compared to the weight of the stories that have surrounded it for so long. Because the stories are much louder than the truth. They carry emotion, they carry fear, they carry the imprint of generations who tried to explain something they didn't understand. And that's when I began to notice something subtle, something I hadn't considered before, that the truth is often quiet, while the stories we build around it are not. We don't tell stories about things that feel ordinary. We tell stories about what stands out, what feels different, what interrupts our sense of what is familiar. And red hair has always done that. Not everywhere, not in every place, but often enough to become something people noticed and then tried to explain in their own way. And when explanation is missing, imagination begins to fill the space. I thought about how that must have felt centuries ago, before we understood anything about genetics, before we had the language to describe variation in a biological sense. To see something rare, something that appears suddenly, without warning, without pattern you can easily recognize, of course it would feel unusual. Of course it would invite interpretation, because the human mind does not sit comfortably with uncertainty. It looks for meaning, even when meaning isn't there. And slowly, those meanings begin to form patterns, ideas passed from one person to another, from one generation to the next, until they become something that feels real. Not because they are true, but because they are repeated often enough and felt deeply enough to take on the shape of truth. I sat with that thought for a while, letting it unfold without rushing past it. Because it wasn't just about red hair anymore. It was about something much more familiar. The way we respond to anything that feels different, the way we observe, interpret, and sometimes misinterpret what we don't fully understand. And I began to wonder, gently without judgment, how many of the things we believe today are built in the same way? How many assumptions, how many quiet conclusions, how many subtle reactions we carry are not based on what something truly is, but on how it first appeared to us? Because first impressions, even when they're incomplete, have a way of staying with us. They shape the stories we tell ourselves, often without us realizing it. And once those stories take root, they become difficult to question, not because we are unwilling, but because we rarely notice them at all. They feel natural, obvious, almost invisible in the way they shape how we see the world. And That is what makes them powerful, not their accuracy, but their quiet persistence. I noticed how that changed the way I thought about something as simple as hair color, because it was never really just about the color itself. It was about what we believed it meant and how easily that meaning could shift depending on the story we chose to attach to it. In one time, it could be feared; in another, admired; in another, simply observed without judgment. The trait itself never changes. Only the story does. And that realization settled deeply, not as something surprising, but as something quietly revealing, because it showed me how fragile our understanding can be when it is built on interpretation instead of clarity, and how easily something simple can become something complicated, just because we never pause long enough to ask what it actually is. I remained there for a while, letting that awareness settle into something deeper than thought, something that didn't need to be resolved immediately, because it felt like I was only beginning to see it, not fully understand it yet. And slowly the question returned, not louder but clearer than before. If something as simple as a gene can be misunderstood for centuries, then how many things around us are still waiting to be seen clearly for the first time? I didn't try to move too quickly toward an answer, because the more I stayed with the question, the more I began to notice something unexpected, something that wasn't immediately obvious at first glance. It wasn't just that red hair had been misunderstood, it was how easily that misunderstanding had spread and how long it had lasted. Because when you look closely at history across different places, different cultures, different time periods, you begin to see a pattern. Not in the trait itself, but in the way people reacted to it. In some places, red hair was admired, seen as rare, even powerful. In others, it was feared, associated with unpredictability, with something unnatural, something that didn't quite belong. And that difference in perception didn't come from the hair itself, it came from the story surrounding it. And I realized something then, something quiet but difficult to ignore, that the same trait, the same exact genetic variation, could be seen in completely opposite ways, depending on the beliefs of the people observing it, which means the meaning was never in the trait, it was always in the interpretation. And slowly, that began to shift the way I thought about everything I had been noticing, because if something as simple as hair color can be seen as beautiful in one moment and dangerous in another, then the difference isn't in reality, it's in perception. I sat with that idea for a while, letting it settle deeper, because it didn't feel like something new. It felt familiar, like something I had experienced before, just in a different form. The way we react to people who seem different from us, the way we notice what stands out and quietly assign meaning to it, even when we don't fully understand it. And I began to wonder, gently, without judgment, how often do we do this without realizing it? How often do we see something unfamiliar, and instead of observing it clearly, we begin to explain it, label it, define it, based on what we already believe? Because the human mind doesn't like uncertainty, it prefers a story, even if that story isn't entirely true, and once that story takes hold, it becomes difficult to separate it from reality itself. That's how myths begin, not from truth, but from interpretation repeated over time. And in the case of red hair, those interpretations became something much larger than the trait itself. They became beliefs. And beliefs, when left unexamined, can shape how entire generations see something, even when the explanation is already there, quietly waiting to be understood. Because the science, as simple as it is, has always been there beneath the surface. A small variation in the MC1R gene influencing how pigment is produced, how light interacts with hair and skin, creating a color that appears different, but is entirely natural. Nothing mysterious, nothing dangerous, just variation. And yet, that quiet truth was almost invisible compared to the stories built around it. I noticed how that changed something in the way I was thinking, because it made me realize that the problem was never the trait itself. It was how we responded to it, how quickly we filled the gap between observation and understanding with assumptions, and how rarely we stopped to question whether those assumptions were actually true. And slowly, the question returned again, but this time it felt different, not just about red hair, but about something much broader. If something so simple can be misunderstood for so long, then what else are we still seeing, not as it truly is, but as we've been told it is? I didn't try to resolve that question, not completely, because something about it felt too open, too expansive to be answered all at once, so instead I stayed with it quietly, letting it unfold at its own pace. If something so simple can be misunderstood for so long, then what else are we still seeing, not as it truly is, but as we've been told it is? And slowly, my attention returned, not to the stories this time, but to the thing itself. Red hair, not as an idea, not as a symbol, not as something surrounded by meaning, but simply as it exists, a color, a variation, a small difference in the way the human body expresses itself. And when I looked at it that way, something shifted again, because stripped of all the stories, all the assumptions, all the interpretations layered over time, there was nothing unusual about it at all. It wasn't trying to stand out. It wasn't trying to mean anything. It simply was, and I realized something then, something quiet but difficult to ignore. That meaning was never part of the trait itself. It was something we added, something we placed onto it over time. And once that meaning is added, it begins to shape how we see it, how we respond to it, how we feel about it, even when we don't fully understand why. I let that settle slowly, without rushing past it, because it felt like I was beginning to see something more clearly, not just about red hair, but about perception itself. The way we don't just observe the world, but interpret it constantly, often without realizing it, and how those interpretations once repeated into feel like truth, even when they are not, even when they are not. I thought again about the gene, the small variation within MC1R, something so subtle, so precise, that it changes how pigment is produced, shifting darker tones into something warmer, something lighter, something we recognize as red, a quiet biological process happening without intention, without meaning, without awareness. And yet, from that, entire narratives had been built, stories of fear, stories of difference, stories of something other. And I began to notice the contrast, not sharply, but gently, between what is and what we believe about what is, because the truth is often simple, and simplicity is easy to overlook. We expect complexity. We expect something dramatic, something hidden, something that explains everything in a way that feels satisfying. But reality rarely works that way. Sometimes it is just a small variation, repeated quietly across generations, without needing to be anything more than what it is. And in that realization, something softened again, not in the world around me, but in the way I related to it, because the need to explain everything, to define everything, to assign meaning to every difference began to feel less necessary. Not wrong, but incomplete. And in its place, something else began to emerge. A quieter kind of attention, one that doesn't rush to interpret, doesn't immediately label, doesn't need to turn everything into a story before it can be understood. Just observing, allowing something to be seen as it is before deciding what it means. And that felt different, slower, calmer, more aligned with what is actually there, instead of what I expect to find. I sat with that for a while, letting the thought settle deeper, not forcing it into a conclusion, because it didn't feel like the end of something. It felt like the beginning of seeing things more clearly. Not just red hair, but everything that appears different, everything that stands out, everything that quietly invites interpretation before understanding. And slowly, the question shifted one final time, not into something more complex, but into something simpler, something almost easy to overlook if I wasn't paying attention. If something as small as a genetic variation can be misunderstood for centuries, then perhaps the real question isn't about what red hair is, but about how we choose to see it and everything else from this moment forward. I didn't move away from that thought too quickly because something about it felt unfinished, not incomplete, but still unfolding, like there was another layer beneath it that I hadn't fully seen yet. So instead, I stayed, allowing my attention to shift, not toward the stories this time, but toward something quieter, something deeper, something that had always been there, but rarely noticed. The origin, not of the stories, but of the trait itself. Because once you begin to separate what something is from what we believe about it, a different kind of question begins to emerge. Not why people misunderstood it, but where it actually comes from. And that question feels different, less emotional, less shaped by perception, more grounded, more still, and slowly I found myself drawn into that quiet space where explanation begins not with meaning, but with structure, with biology, with something that exists beneath appearance, beneath interpretation, deep within the human body, a gene, small, precise, and almost invisible in the way it does its work. MC1R, not a dramatic name, not something that sounds powerful or significant, and yet within it is a subtle shift, one that changes how pigment is produced, how color appears, how light is reflected in ways we rarely think about. In most people, this gene helps create darker pigments, shades that absorb more light, tones that feel familiar, expected. But in some, this process changes, not completely, not in a way that disrupts anything, just slightly, enough to shift the balance, enough to allow something else to emerge, a different kind of pigment, one that reflects light more softly, more warmly, and what appears is something we recognize instantly, even if we don't understand it. Red hair, not as an anomaly, not as something outside the natural order, but as a variation quietly existing within it. And I realized something then, something that felt both simple and strangely profound, that this trait, which has carried so many stories, so many meanings, so many assumptions over time, begins in something incredibly small, a tiny change at a level we cannot see, cannot feel, cannot observe directly. And yet from that, everything else follows: appearance, perception, reaction, story. And I began to notice the contrast again, not sharply, but gently, between the scale of the cause and the scale of the meaning we attach to it. Because the cause is quiet, biological, neutral, but the meaning becomes emotional, cultural, layered over time, and often far removed from the original source itself. I sat with that thought, letting it unfold slowly, without trying to reduce it into something simple or final. Because it wasn't just about understanding a gene, it was about seeing how easily something small can become something much larger once it passes through human perception. And slowly another layer began to appear, one I hadn't fully considered before, because this variation, this shift in pigment, didn't appear randomly, without reason. It remained over time, across generations, which means in some way it served a purpose, not a symbolic one. Not something we assign meaning to after the fact, but a biological one, something connected to survival, to environment, to the way the human body adapts to the world around it. And that realization changed something again, quietly, but clearly, because it meant that we once misunderstood, what we once feared, what we once turned into stories of difference, may have been simply part of how humans adapted, how they survived, how they continued to exist in environments that required subtle changes over time. Not strange, not unusual, just necessary, in a way we are only beginning to understand. And I noticed how that shifted the feeling entirely, because instead of seeing red hair as something rare in a mysterious sense, I began to see it as something natural, something connected, something that belongs exactly where it appears, not separate from the human story, but part of it. And as that awareness settled more deeply, the question returned again, not as something uncertain, but as something quietly revealing. If something so small can shape how we look, how we are seen, and how we're understood across generations, then how much of what we believe about each other is really just the surface of something much deeper, quietly unfolding beneath it? I stayed with that thought, not trying to rush ahead, not trying to turn it into something definitive, because something about it felt like it needed space, the kind of space where understanding grows slowly, almost quietly, without being forced. If something so small can shape how we look, how we are seen, and how we are understood across generations, then perhaps what we see on the surface is never the full story. And that realization led me somewhere deeper. Not into history this time, not into perception, but into the quiet relationship between the human body and the world it exists within. Because nothing in the body remains by accident for long. Variations appear, yes, but over time, only some of them remain. And when they do, it often means something subtle has taken place, something connected to survival, to adaptation, to the way the body responds to its environment. And I began to see red hair differently again. Not just as a variation, but as part of a larger pattern, something shaped slowly over thousands of years. In regions where sunlight is limited, where the sky remains pale, where warmth is softer and less direct, the body begins to adjust, not in dramatic ways, not suddenly, but gradually, quietly, over generations. Because light, something so constant, something we rarely question, plays a deeper role than we often realize. It influences how the body produces vitamin D, how skin responds to exposure, how pigment develops or becomes less necessary over time. And in environments where sunlight is weaker, where exposure is limited, lighter pigmentation begins to offer an advantage, not aesthetic, not symbolic, but functional, allowing the body to absorb what it needs more efficiently, more effectively. And within that shift, something else appears, hair, that reflects this change, not intentionally, not designed, but simply emerging. As part of a system adjusting itself to the conditions around it, and that is where red hair begins to make quiet sense. Not as something rare and mysterious in isolation, but as part of a broader adaptation, something connected to environment, to survival, to the subtle ways the body aligns itself with the world it inhabits. I let that idea settle slowly, because it felt different from everything that came before it. Not emotional, not shaped by fear or perception, but grounded, steady, almost inevitable. Because when you begin to see things this way, the story changes completely. What once felt unusual begins to feel natural. What once felt separate begins to feel connected. And what once carried meaning begins to return to something simpler, something quieter, something real. I noticed how that shifted something in me again. Not dramatically, but gently. Because it removed the sense that this trait needed explanation beyond what it already was. It didn't need a story to justify it. It didn't need meaning assigned to it. It already had a place within the larger process of human adaptation. Even with that understanding, I couldn't ignore something else. Because while the body adapts quietly, naturally, without intention, the human mind does not work the same way. We don't just observe change, we interpret it. We assign meaning to it, we build narratives around it, often long before we understand what we are actually seeing. And that contrast between what is happening and how we respond to it felt important, because it revealed something deeper than just the origin of a trait. It revealed something about us, about how we process difference, how we react to what stands out, even when it is completely natural. And I began to wonder, gently, without judgment, if the body adapts quietly in response to the world, then why does the mind so often react with noise, with assumption, with stories that may not reflect reality at all? Because in the case of red hair, the truth was always there, simple, biological, connected to environment and adaptation. And yet it took centuries for that truth to become visible beneath everything we had layered on top of it. And slowly the question returned again, not as something uncertain, but as something quietly revealing. If the world shapes us in ways we barely notice, then how often do we misunderstand those changes, simply because we are too quick to explain what we have not yet taken the time to truly see? I didn't move past that question too quickly, because something about it felt like it was pointing towards something deeper, something that wasn't just about red hair or genetics or even history, but about the way we understand change itself. If the world shapes us in ways we barely notice, then how often do we misunderstand those changes, simply because we are too quick to explain what we have not yet taken the time to truly see? And slowly, my attention shifted again. Not outward this time, but inward, toward the quiet process that is always happening beneath the surface of life. Adaptation, not something we feel directly, not something we are aware of in the moment, but something that unfolds slowly across time, across generations without asking for attention. Because the body does not adapt all at once. It does not change suddenly or dramatically. It responds gradually to the conditions around it, to light, to temperature, to environment, and over time, those responses begin to take shape, becoming visible in ways we can observe but often do not fully understand. Red hair is one of those shapes, a visible expression of something much quieter happening beneath the surface. A shift in how pigment is produced, a subtle change in how the body interacts with light, and yet, when we see it, we rarely think about that process. We see the result, not the cause, and that is where misunderstanding begins. Because when we only see the surface, we begin to fill in the rest with assumptions. We explain what we see based on what we already believe, not on what is actually happening beneath it. I sat with that thought, letting it settle slowly because it felt familiar, not just in this context, but in many others as well. How often do we do the same thing with everything around us? We see a result, a difference, something that stands out. And instead of asking how it came to be, we decide what it means. And once that meaning is assigned, it becomes difficult to separate it from reality itself. And I began to notice how that pattern had played out over time in the case of red hair, not because people were trying to misunderstand it, but because they were trying to make sense of it without having the tools to do so accurately. So they turned to what they had: stories, beliefs, explanation that felt complete, even when they were not grounded in the underlying truth. And those explanations, once repeated enough, became something stable, something accepted, something rarely questioned. And that is how something natural becomes something misunderstood, not through intention, but through the quiet accumulation of assumptions over time. I noticed how that changed the way I saw the entire process, because it wasn't just about correcting the misunderstanding, it was about recognizing how easily misunderstanding can happen in the first place, and how often it continues, even now. Because even today, with access to knowledge, to science, to deeper understanding, we still carry traces of those old perceptions. Subtle, often unnoticed, but present in the way we react to difference, in the way we form impressions quickly before understanding fully. And I began to wonder, gently, without judgment, if adaptation is something that happens slowly, quietly, beneath the surface of awareness, then perhaps understanding should move the same way. Not rushed, not immediate, but patient, willing to look deeper beyond what is immediately visible. And that thought felt different because it shifted the focus again, not just toward what something is, but toward how we choose to see it and how easily that choice shapes everything that follows. I remained there for a while, letting that awareness settle into something deeper than thought, something that didn't need to be resolved, only observed. Because it didn't feel like I was reaching a conclusion. It felt like I was beginning to see a pattern, one that extends far beyond this single trait or this single story. And slowly, the question returned again, not as something uncertain, but as something quietly revealing. If the body changes in response to the world, with patience, with precision, without needing explanation, then what would change if we learned to understand those changes with the same quiet attention instead of filling them with meaning too quickly? I didn't try to answer that question immediately, because something about it felt like it needed time, not just to be understood, but to be experienced, quietly, the way everything else in this process had unfolded so far. If the body changes in response to the world with patience, with precision, without needing explanation, then what would change if we learned to understand those changes with the same quiet attention instead of filling them with meaning too quickly? At first, the answer didn't come as words. It came as a shift, subtle, almost unnoticeable, in the way I was observing things, because instead of reacting, instead of interpreting immediately, I began to pause, not for long, just enough to see what was actually there before deciding what it meant. And in that pause, something different began to emerge. Not confusion, not uncertainty, but clarity. A quieter kind of clarity, one that doesn't rush to conclusions, but allows understanding to take shape gradually. I noticed how rarely I had done that before. How quickly I had moved from observation to interpretation, from seeing something to deciding what it meant, almost instantly. And I realized something then, something that felt both simple and deeply familiar, that most of what we misunderstand is not because the truth is hidden, but because we don't stay with it long enough to let it reveal itself. We rush ahead. We explain too quickly. We fill the space between not knowing and knowing with assumptions that feel complete but are often incomplete. And over time, those assumptions begin to feel like truth, even when they are not. I thought again about red hair, not as a concept, not as a story, but as something real, something observable. A variation in pigment, a subtle shift in biology, a natural response shaped over time by the environment in which people lived. There was nothing hidden about it, nothing mysterious in the way we once believed, only something that required a different kind of attention to be understood clearly. And yet, for so long, that attention was missing. not because people didn't care, but because they didn't know how to look beyond what was immediately visible. And so they did what humans have always done. They created meaning, they told stories, they filled the unknown with something that felt known, and in doing so, they moved further away from the truth without ever realizing it. I sat with that thought for a while, letting it settle deeper, not as something to judge, but as something to recognize. Because it wasn't just something that happened in the past, it is something that continues, even now, in quieter ways, in more subtle forms, in the way we respond to things that feel unfamiliar, even today. And slowly, I began to see that this story was never just about red hair. It was about the space between what is and what we believe about what is. A space that is often filled too quickly, a space that rarely remains open long enough for true understanding to emerge. And I wondered gently, without urgency, what would happen if we allowed that space to remain open just a little longer? If we stayed with what we see before deciding what it means? If we observed before we explained? If we allowed difference to exist without immediately turning it into something that needs to be understood or defined? And that thought felt different, not like a conclusion, not like something final, but like an invitation, a quieter way of seeing, a slower way of understanding, one that doesn't rush ahead of reality but moves alongside it, allowing truth to appear in its own time without forcing it into place. And in that, something shifted again, not in the world itself, but in the way I was within it, because I no longer felt the need to explain everything immediately. I no longer felt the same urgency to assign meaning to what I didn't yet fully understand, and in that quiet space, something else became possible, a clearer, calmer, more accurate way of seeing, not perfect, but closer to what is actually there. And as that awareness settled, the question returned one final time, softer than before, almost like it no longer needed an answer. If understanding takes time, and truth often appears quietly beneath the surface of what we first believe, then perhaps the real question is not what red hair means, but whether we are willing to see it and everything else as it truly is, when we finally take the time to look closely enough. I didn't move away from that question too quickly, because something about it felt like it was pointing towards something more grounded, something that wasn't just about perception anymore, but about how those perceptions had shaped real history, real lives, in ways that are easy to overlook if we only stay in abstraction. If we now understand what red hair truly is, a small variation in the MC1R gene, a shift in how pigment is produced, something entirely natural, entirely human, then what happened in the long stretch of time before that understanding existed? And slowly my attention moved backward, not in a dramatic way, but gently into the quiet weight of history. Because there was a time not so long ago when people didn't have access to genetics or biology or any clear explanation for why something like red hair appeared at all. And when explanation is missing, something else takes its place. Story, belief, meaning, built from what people feel rather than what they know. And I began to see how that played out across centuries. In parts of medieval Europe, red hair became something more than a physical trait. It became a sign, not a scientific one, but a symbolic one, associated with unpredictability, with something other, with something that didn't quite fit into the expectations people held about how the world should look. And in some cases, that difference was enough to create suspicion, not always openly, not always violently, but quietly, persistently, through the way people were seen, judged, and sometimes misunderstood before they were ever known. And I realized something then, something that felt both simple and difficult to ignore, that the same trait that today we understand as a harmless genetic variation was once interpreted through an entirely different lens. Not because it changed, but because understanding had not yet arrived. And in that absence, perception filled the space. I thought about how easily that happens, even now. When something appears that we don't fully understand, we rarely wait for clarity. We explain it using what we already believe. And over time, those explanations begin to feel real. Not because they are true, but because they are repeated, shared, accepted. And I began to notice how this pattern, this movement from uncertainty to assumption, had shaped so much of the story around red hair, not just once, but again and again in different places, in different ways. Because what is rare often becomes noticeable, and what is noticeable often becomes meaningful, even when that meaning isn't grounded in reality itself. And I sat with that thought for a while, letting it settle more deeply, because it wasn't just about correcting the past. It was about understanding how easily the past came to be the way it was. Because without knowledge, without explanation, people did the only thing they could do. They created meaning. And that meaning slowly became belief. And belief, over time, shaped perception in ways that felt stable, even when they were built on incomplete understanding. And I began to see how different everything looks once the underlying cause becomes clear. Once we understand that red hair is not a sign, not a symbol, not an indication of anything beyond itself, but simply the result of a variation in the MC1R gene, influencing the production of pheomelanin instead of darker pigments, a quiet biological process, nothing more. And yet, that simple truth took centuries to emerge clearly, beneath everything that had been layered on top of it. And I realized something then, something that felt both grounding and quietly revealing. That misunderstanding is not always the result of error. Sometimes it is simply the absence of knowledge, filled by the human need to explain what feels uncertain. And I wondered, gently without judgment, if we had lived in that time, without the knowledge we have now, would we have seen it any differently? Or would we have done the same thing, quietly, naturally, filling the unknown with meaning, until it felt like truth? And slowly, that question settled into something deeper, not just about red hair, but about how easily something real, something simple, can become something else entirely when we try to understand it before we truly see what it is. I didn't move past that realization too quickly, because something about it felt like it was asking me to look more closely, not just at what people believed, but at how those beliefs actually showed up in real places, in real lives, across time. Because it's one thing to say that red hair was misunderstood, but it's something else entirely to see how that misunderstanding took shape in the world itself. And slowly, my attention moved again, not toward theory, but toward specific moments, specific cultures, where this small genetic variation became something much larger than it really was. In medieval Europe, particularly in certain regions, red hair didn't just stand out visually, it stood out symbolically. Not because of science, but because of association, because people began to link it, not to biology, but to ideas that already existed in their belief systems. Ideas about morality, about purity, about what belonged, and what did not. And in that context, red hair sometimes became connected to suspicion, to unpredictability, even in extreme cases to accusations of witchcraft, not as a universal rule, not everywhere, but often enough to leave a trace in history that still lingers, even now. And I realized something then, something that felt both subtle and deeply important, that the trait itself never carried any of that meaning. It was placed onto it, quietly, gradually, through repetition, through shared belief, through the human tendency to connect what we see to what we already think we understand. And once that connection is made, it becomes difficult to separate the two, because the meaning begins to feel inseparable from the thing itself. Even when it was never truly part of it to begin with, I thought about how that must have felt, not in theory, but in experience. To live in a time where something you carry, something you did not choose, something as simple as hair color, could shape how others see you before you even speak. Not always directly, not always openly, but in small, quiet ways. A glance, a hesitation, a subtle difference in how you are perceived before anything else is known about you. And I began to understand something more clearly. That history is not only made of events, it is made of perception, of how people saw each other, of how meaning was assigned, long before understanding existed. And in that space between what is real and what is believed, entire narratives can form, narratives that persist even when the original cause becomes clear. Because once a belief is established, it doesn't disappear immediately when new knowledge appears. It fades slowly, over time, as understanding replaces assumption, piece by piece. And I began to see how that process is still unfolding even now. Because even today, red hair remains rare, appearing in only a small percentage of the global population, often estimated around 1 to 2%. And that rarity continues to make it noticeable, not in the same way as before, not shaped by fear or superstition in most places, but still different enough to draw attention. And I realized something then, something that felt both grounding and quietly revealing, that even when the story changes, the perception doesn't disappear completely. It shifts, it softens, but traces remain. Not because we hold on to them intentionally, but because perception, like history, moves slowly. And I sat with that for a while, letting it settle deeper, because it didn't feel like something to correct or to fix. It felt like something to understand more fully. The way meaning forms, the way it persists, the way it gradually changes as new understanding begins to take its place. And I began to wonder, gently, without urgency, if something as simple as a genetic variation can carry so much meaning across so much time, then how many other things in our world today are still being seen not as they truly are, but through the quiet weight of stories that have not yet fully faded away? I didn't move away from that thought too quickly, because something about it felt like it was still unfolding, not just as history, but as something that continues, even now. If something as simple as a genetic variation can carry so much meaning across so much time, then what happens when that meaning begins to change? Not disappear all at once, but slowly, gradually, as new understanding begins to take its place. And I began to notice something, not in the distant past this time, but in the shift that has already happened. Because today, red hair is no longer widely feared or associated with the same beliefs that once surrounded it. The language has changed. The explanations are clearer. We understand that this trait comes from a variation in the MC1R gene, affecting how pigment is produced, leading to higher levels of pheomelanin instead of darker eumelanin. A simple biological process, nothing hidden, nothing symbolic. And yet, even with that clarity, something remains, not the old fear, not the same misunderstanding, but a quieter version of difference, because rarity still carries weight. Even when it is understood, and I realized something then, something that felt both subtle and important to notice, that the shift from misunderstanding to understanding does not erase perception entirely. It transforms it, it softens it, but it doesn't disappear overnight. Because perception is not only shaped by knowledge, it is shaped by familiarity, by how often we see something, by how easily it fits into what we expect the world to look like. And red hair, even now, remains uncommon enough to stand out. Not in a negative way, not in the same way it once did, but still noticeable, still slightly outside of what most people see every day. And that alone is enough to create a subtle shift in attention, not judgment. Not assumption in the same form as before, but awareness, a moment of noticing that something is different. And I began to understand something more clearly, that difference itself is not the problem. It never was. The problem was always in the meaning we attached to it. And now, as that meaning begins to fade, what remains is simply variation, a natural part of the human story, not something to explain away, not something to correct, but something to recognize as part of how humans exist across different environments, across time. And I thought again gently about how that variation came to be. The adaptation to lower sunlight, the need for efficient vitamin D production in regions with less direct light, the way lighter pigmentation, including red hair, can emerge as part of that process. Not intentionally, not designed, but shaped slowly by the interaction between the human body and the environment it exists within. And I realized something then, something that felt both grounding and quietly reassuring, that what once seemed unusual or unexplained is often simply the result of processes we are only beginning to understand more clearly. And as that understanding grows, the need for stories, for assumptions, for meaning built from uncertainty begins to fade. Not completely, but enough to see things more as they are. And I sat with that for a while, letting it settle deeper. Because it didn't feel like the end of something. It felt like a transition from misunderstanding to clarity, from assumption to observation, from meaning to something simpler. And slowly that can return again, not as something uncertain, but as something quietly revealing. If understanding can change the story but not immediately remove the feeling of difference, then what does it take for perception itself to fully align with what we now know to be true? I didn't try to answer that question too quickly, because something about it felt like it required patience, not just in thought, but in the way understanding itself unfolds, slowly across time, just as the misunderstanding once did. If understanding can change the story, but not immediately remove the feeling of difference, then what does it take for perception itself to fully align with what we now know to be true? At first, I thought the answer would be knowledge. More information, more explanation, a clearer understanding of genetics, of the MC1R gene, of how pheomelanin creates the red tones we see, and in a way, that is true. Because knowledge changes the foundation, it replaces myth with clarity, it removes fear by revealing what was never dangerous to begin with. But the more I stayed with the question, the more I realized knowledge alone is not enough, because knowledge exists in the mind. But perception lives in experience, in what we see again and again, in what becomes familiar over time, in what no longer feels unusual simply because it has become part of what we recognize as normal. And I began to notice something subtle but important, that perception doesn't change through explanation alone. It changes through exposure, through repetition, through the quiet process of seeing something enough times that it no longer stands out in the same way it once did. And that made me think differently about red hair again. Not just as a trait, not just as a genetic variation, but as something that moves through visibility across time. Because in places where red hair is more common, in regions like Scotland or Ireland, where the percentage of people with this trait is significantly higher, the perception is different, not because the biology changes, but because familiarity does. What is rare elsewhere becomes ordinary there. What stands out in one place blends naturally into the background in another. And I realized something then, something that felt both simple and quietly revealing. That difference is not fixed, it is relative. It depends not only on what something is, but on how often it is seen, and how deeply it is integrated into what we recognize as normal. And I sat with that for a while, letting it settle because it didn't feel like a conclusion. It felt like a shift in perspective, because it showed me that the story of red hair was never really about the trait itself. It was about context, about perception shaped by rarity, by unfamiliarity, by the human tendency to notice what appears outside of expectation. And once that expectation changes, the meaning changes with it. Not suddenly, not completely, but gradually, quietly, in the same way everything else in this story has unfolded. And I began to see how this connects to something broader, something that extends beyond this single example. Because if perception is shaped by familiarity, then understanding is not just about learning what is true, it is about allowing what is true to become familiar, to be seen again and again, until it no longer feels different, until it simply becomes part of what is. And I wondered, gently, without urgency, if that is how perception changes, not through force, not through correction, but through quiet repetition, through exposure, through time. Then perhaps what we are seeing now is not the end of misunderstanding, but the gradual movement away from it, a slow alignment between what we know and how we experience what we know. And that thought felt calm, steady, almost reassuring, because it didn't require immediate change. It didn't demand perfection. It simply suggested that understanding, like everything else in this story, unfolds slowly. And as that awareness settled, the question softened, not disappearing, but becoming something quieter, something that no longer asked for a direct answer, but simply remained as a reminder. If perception changes with familiarity, and familiarity grows with time, then perhaps the story of red hair was never something fixed in the past, but something still unfolding, even now, as we continue to learn and quietly begin to see it as it has always been. I didn't feel the need to return to the past again, not in the same way, because something about the story had already shifted, not just in what happened, but in how it continues to exist quietly in the present. And as I stayed with that awareness, another layer began to appear, one that felt less about history and more about how this rare trait moves through the modern world, in ways that are subtle but still meaningful. Because even now, even with everything we understand about the MC1R gene, about pigmentation, about how red hair forms through increased pheomelanin and reduced eumelanin, the experience of being different has not completely disappeared. It has changed, it has softened, but it still exists in quieter ways. And I began to notice something, not through large events, not through dramatic stories, but through small, everyday moments. The way attention gathers briefly, the way someone might be described first by what stands out visually before anything else is known, the way rarity still draws the eye, even when it no longer carries the same meaning it once did. And I realized something then, something that felt both simple and deeply human, that even when understanding replaces fear, attention remains, not because something is wrong, but because something is uncommon. And the human mind naturally notices what it does not see often. Not with judgment, not with the same assumptions as before, but with awareness, a quiet recognition that something is different from what is familiar. And I sat with that for a while, letting it unfold because it didn't feel like a problem to solve. It felt like something to understand more gently because difference itself is not negative. It never was. It only becomes complicated when we assign meaning to it too quickly. And in the absence of that meaning, what remains is something much simpler: variation, a natural part of how humans exist across environments, across time. And I began to think again about how red hair fits into that broader picture, a rare expression of a gene, carried through generations. More common in certain regions like Northern Europe, where environmental conditions once favored lighter pigmentation for vitamin D absorption, less common elsewhere, but always present, always part of the larger human story. And I realized something then, something that felt grounding in a quiet way. That rarity does not make something separate, it only makes it less frequently seen. And that distinction is important, because what we see less often, we tend to notice more. And what we notice more, we sometimes believe carries more meaning than it actually does. And that is where perception begins, again. Not in misunderstanding, as it once did, but in subtle awareness, in the quiet way attention shifts toward what stands out. And I began to wonder, gently, without urgency, what would happen if we recognized that moment, not as something significant, but simply as the mind doing what it naturally does. Not something to follow, not something to build upon, but something to notice and allow to pass. And in that noticing, something changed again. Not in what I was seeing, but in how I related to it. Because instead of moving immediately into interpretation, there was a brief pause, a quiet space where the moment remained simple, uncomplicated, free from the need to become anything more than what it was. And I realized something then, something that felt both calm and quietly complete, that understanding does not remove difference, it removes the unnecessary meaning attached to it, leaving behind something much simpler, something that has always been there. A natural variation within the wider pattern of human life. And as I stayed with that awareness, the story no longer felt like something that needed to be explained further. It felt like something that had already revealed itself, slowly, across time, through science, through history, through the quiet process of seeing more clearly. And the question that remained was no longer about what red hair is, but something softer, something closer to how we live with what we now understand. If we no longer misunderstand the trait, then how do we allow that understanding to shape the way we see and respond in the quiet moments where difference still appears? I didn't try to answer that question too quickly, because something about it felt like it wasn't asking for a direct response, but for a deeper kind of attention, the kind that notices what happens in the smallest moments, where understanding either remains or quietly fades. If we no longer misunderstand the trait, then how do we allow that understanding to shape the way we see and respond in the quiet moments where difference still appears? At first, I thought the answer might be simple, that once we know the truth, once we understand the role of the MC1R gene, how it shifts pigment production toward pheomelanin, how it is more common in regions with lower sunlight, how it supports vitamin D synthesis in those environments, that would be enough. That knowledge alone would naturally guide perception. But the more I paid attention, the more I noticed it doesn't work that way. Because knowledge does not always arrive in the moment. It exists somewhere in the background, while perception happens instantly, quietly, automatically, before thought has time to catch up. and began to see how that creates a subtle gap, a space between what we know and how we actually experience what we see. Because in that brief moment, when something stands out, the mind responds before understanding fully arrives. Not with judgment, not with intention, but with recognition of difference. And that recognition, while natural, can still shape the moment, unless something else is present, awareness, a quiet noticing of the reaction itself. And I realized something then, something that felt both simple and quietly powerful, that understanding only becomes real when it meets awareness in the moment it is needed. Not later, not in theory, but right there, in the instant where perception begins to form. And I sat with that for a while, letting it settle because it felt like continuation of everything that had come before. Not a new idea, but a deeper layer of the same process. The movement from misunderstanding to knowledge, and now from knowledge to lived awareness. And I began to notice how different that feels, because when awareness is present, even briefly, the moment changes, not in what is seen, but in how it is held. There is less urgency, less movement toward immediate interpretation, more space for what is actually there to remain simple. A person, a variation in appearance, nothing more. And I realized something then, something that felt grounding in a quiet way, that the story of red hair was never just about correcting a misunderstanding in the past. It is also about how we carry that correction into the present, how we allow it to shape the way we see in real time. Because without that step, knowledge remains separate from experience, and perception continues unchanged, not out of resistance, but simply because it moves faster than reflection. And I began to wonder, gently, without urgency, what it would feel like if awareness became part of that process more consistently, not forced, not constant, but present, just often enough to create space between what we see and what we assume. And that thought felt different, not like something to achieve, but something to return to. Again and again, in small moments, each time something stands out, each time attention shifts, each time the mind begins to move toward meaning before understanding fully arrives. And in that return, something begins to change. Not suddenly, not completely, but gradually, quietly. In the same way, everything else in this story has unfolded. Through time, through repetition, through the slow alignment between what is true and how we come to see what is true. And as that awareness settled more deeply, the question softened again, not disappearing, but becoming something quieter, something that no longer asked to be answered directly, but simply to be lived. If understanding is already here, then perhaps what matters now is not learning something new, but remembering to see what we already know when the moment arrives. I didn't move forward from that thought too quickly, because something about it felt like it was still unfolding, not in theory, but in the way it quietly appears in real life in moments so small they are easy to miss, unless I stay with them just a little longer. If understanding is already here, then perhaps what matters now is not learning something new, but remembering to see what we already know when the moment arrives. At first, that felt almost too subtle to matter. Just remembering, just noticing, just allowing what is already understood to remain present when perception begins to form. And yet, the more I paid attention, the more I realized how easily that is forgotten. Because perception doesn't wait, it doesn't pause for knowledge to arrive, it moves instantly, quietly shaping the moment before awareness has time to catch up. And I began to notice how this plays out even now. Even in a world where the science is clear, where we understand that red hair is simply a genetic variation carried through the MC1R gene, expressed through higher levels of pheomelanin, appearing more frequently in certain populations like those in Northern Europe. All of that is already known, and yet, in the moment of seeing, something else still happens. A shift in attention, a recognition of rarity, a subtle awareness that this is not something we encounter often. And I realized something then, something that felt both simple and quietly revealing, that knowledge does not erase the first moment of perception, it follows it, and what matters is what happens in that space between the two. That brief moment where something stands out before it becomes understood again. And I began to see that this is where the story continues. Not in history, not in science, but in that space. Because if that moment passes unnoticed, then perception remains unchanged, even if knowledge exists somewhere in the background. But if that moment is seen, even briefly, something shifts, not dramatically, but enough to prevent the old pattern from fully taking hold again. And I sat with that, letting it unfold slowly, because it didn't feel like something to control or to perfect. It felt like something to notice again and again without pressure, because change, in this way, does not come from force, it comes from repetition, from returning gently to awareness each time the moment appears. And I began to understand something more clearly, that the story of red hair is no longer about correcting what misunderstood in the past. That part has already begun to shift. The deeper part of the story is happening now, in how we carry that understanding forward, in how we allow it to influence the way we see in real time, in how we respond, not just with knowledge, but with awareness. And I noticed how that changes the experience itself, because when awareness is present, even slightly, the moment becomes quieter, less shaped by assumption, less driven by the need to define what is seen immediately. And in that quiet, something else becomes possible, a way of seeing that stays closer to what is actually there, not adding meaning, not removing difference, but allowing both to exist without conflict. And I realized something then, something that felt both calm and quietly complete. That difference was never the problem. Misunderstanding was, and once misunderstanding begins to fade, what remains is simply variation within the same shared human experience, nothing separate, nothing to explain beyond what it already is. And as I stayed with that awareness, the question softened again, not disappearing, but becoming something quieter. Something that no longer needed to be answered, only noticed each time the moment appeared. If perception still moves quickly, and awareness moves more slowly, then perhaps understanding is not something we reach once, but something we return to each time we choose to see a little more clearly than before. I didn't feel the need to rush beyond that awareness, because something about it felt like it had already brought me somewhere important, not to a final answer, but to a quieter understanding, one that continues to unfold. Each time I return to it, each time I notice the moment where perception begins to move ahead of what is actually there. If perception still moves quickly and awareness moves more slowly, then perhaps understanding is not something we reach once, but something we return to again and again, each time we choose to see more clearly. And as I stayed with that, something else began to emerge, something that hadn't been fully seen yet, not in the science, not in the history, but in the way this entire story connects to something much broader, something that extends beyond red hair itself. Because when I look at it now, quietly, without rushing to define it, I no longer see just a rare trait. I see a pattern of how humans respond to difference across time. First, something appears that does not fit what is familiar. Then, attention gathers, then meaning is created, not from knowledge, but from what feels understandable in that moment. And over time, that meaning becomes belief, and belief becomes perception, and perception begins to feel like reality itself, until something shifts, until understanding arrives, slowly, through observation, through science, through the gradual uncovering of what was always there beneath the surface. And I realized something then, something that felt both simple and deeply revealing, that this pattern is not unique to red hair. It is something we do again and again with anything that feels unfamiliar, anything that stands out, anything that we notice before we fully understand. And I sat with that thought, letting it settle more deeply, because it didn't feel like something distant. It felt close, present, something that still happens in quiet ways, even now. Because even today, even with everything we know, we still encounter things, people, differences that we do not immediately understand. And in those moments, the same process begins again: attention, interpretation, meaning. Unless something interrupts it, unless awareness enters gently, before the meaning becomes fixed. And I began to see how this story was never just about correcting one misunderstanding. It was about recognizing the process itself, seeing it clearly, not only in the past, but in the present, and perhaps allowing it to unfold differently each time we notice it happening. And I thought again, quietly, about red hair, returning to it, not as an abstract idea, but as something real, something simple, something that has always been what it is, a variation in a gene, MC1R, a shift in pigment production, favoring pheomelanin, a trait that appears more frequently in certain regions where environmental conditions once shaped how the human body adapted to light. Nothing more, nothing hidden. And yet, from that, an entire story was built. Not because it needed to be, but because we needed to understand it before we had the means to truly see it clearly. And I realized something then, something that felt calm, almost complete in its own quiet way, that the story of red hair was never about mystery. It was about the journey from not knowing to knowing, from assumption to clarity, from seeing through belief to seeing what is actually there. And that journey is not finished, not in the sense of needing more answers, but in the sense that it continues each time we encounter something new, something unfamiliar, something that invites us to see before we decide what it means. And as I stayed with that awareness, there was nothing left to add. No final conclusion, no explanation that needed to be completed, only this, a quiet recognition that what we once misunderstood was never truly hidden. It was simply waiting for us to learn how to see it clearly. I didn't feel the need to search for anything new anymore, because something about the story had already revealed what it needed to reveal. Not all at once, but slowly, piece by piece, until what once felt mysterious began to feel simple, almost quiet in its clarity. And as I stayed with that feeling, another layer began to appear. Not about the past, not about misunderstanding, but about how this story settles into something deeper, something that remains, even after everything has been explained, because when the mystery fades, something else is left behind. Not emptiness, but understanding. A quieter kind of understanding that doesn't need to explain itself anymore. And I began to notice how that feels, not in theory, but in experience, because when I think about red hair now, not as something surrounded by stories, not as something misunderstood, but simply as what it is. A rare expression of the MC1R gene. A variation in pigmentation, shaped over time by environment, by light, by the subtle ways the human body adapts to survive. It no longer feels like something that needs interpretation. It feels complete, as it is. And I realized something then, something that felt both simple and deeply grounding, that understanding does not always add something new. Sometimes it removes what was never needed in the first place. The assumptions, the meanings that were placed onto something before it was truly seen, the quiet layers of interpretation that made something simple feel complex. And once those layers begin to fall away, what remains is often much closer, much clearer than we expected. And I sat with that for a while, letting it settle, because it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a return, back to what was always there, before the stories, before the beliefs, before the need to explain what had not yet been understood. And I began to see how this connects to something broader, something that extends beyond this single trait. Because how many things in our world carry meaning that was added rather than inherent? How many differences have been shaped not by what they are, but by how we have chosen to interpret them over time? And I wondered gently, without urgency, if understanding something fully is not just about learning more, but about seeing what can be removed, what can be let go of, so that what remains can be seen clearly. And I noticed how that changes the way I relate to this story, because it is no longer about uncovering something hidden. It is about recognizing something that was always visible, but not always understood. And I thought again, quietly, about the journey this trait has taken through history, from mystery to myth, from myth to explanation, from explanation to understanding, and now from understanding to something even quieter, acceptance, not forced, not declared, but natural, emerging from the simple recognition that nothing more needs to be added for it to make sense. And I realized something then, something that felt calm and complete in its own way, that the story of red hair was never about discovering something extraordinary. It was about learning to see something ordinary, without the layers that once made it seem otherwise. And as I stayed with that awareness, the need to explain, to define, to conclude began to soften, because everything that needed to be understood was already there, not hidden, not complex, just waiting to be seen clearly. I didn't feel the need to push the story any further, because something about it had already come full circle, not in a dramatic way, not with a clear ending, but with a quiet sense that what once felt distant had become close, almost familiar in a way I hadn't expected. And as I stayed with that feeling, something else began to emerge, not as a question this time, but as a reflection, something softer, something that felt less like discovery and more like recognition. Because when everything has been explained, when the science is clear, when the history has been seen for what it was, what remains is how we carry that understanding forward, not as information, but as part of how we see, how we respond, how we move through the small moments where difference still appears. And I began to notice something gently, without judgment, that even when a story is corrected, even when misunderstanding fades, the way we see does not change all at once. It continues slowly, quietly, shaped by repetition, by familiarity, by the subtle ways awareness returns to the moment again and again. And I realized something then, something that felt both simple and deeply human, that understanding is not a single moment. It is a process, not something we reach once, but something we live each time we encounter what we now know to be true. And I thought again, quietly, about the nature of this trait, returning to it not as something to analyze, but as something to see clearly one more time. Red hair, a rare expression of the MC1R gene, a variation that leads to higher levels of pheomelanin, creating lighter, warmer tones, more commonly found in certain regions like Northern and Western Europe, where environmental conditions once shaped how the human body adapted to lower sunlight exposure, a biological process, consistent, quiet, unchanged by the meanings that were once placed upon it. And I noticed how different that feels now. Not because the trait has changed, but because the way it is understood has become simpler, closer to what it actually is. And I began to understand something more clearly, that clarity does not always come from adding new information. Sometimes it comes from returning again and again to what is already known until it becomes natural, until it no longer needs to be explained at all. And I sat with that for a while, letting it settle deeper, because it didn't feel like something I needed to remember actively. It felt like something that becomes part of how I see, without effort, over time. Because once something is understood clearly enough, it begins to shape perception, quietly, from within. Not through force, not through intention, but through familiarity, through repetition, through the gradual alignment between what we know and how we experience what we know. And I began to see how this completes the story, not by ending it, but by bringing it back to where it began. A simple variation, once misunderstood, now seen more clearly, not transformed, not changed, but understood differently. And that difference is everything, because it shows how much of what we experience is shaped not by what is there, but by how we come to see it over time. And I wondered, gently, without urgency, if that is true for something as simple as a hair color, then how many other things in our world are still waiting, not to change, but to be seen more clearly? And as that thought settled, there was nothing more to add, no final explanation, no conclusion that needed to be reached, only this quiet awareness that what once felt mysterious was never truly hidden. It was simply waiting for understanding to become clear enough that nothing more needed to be said. I didn't feel the need to move toward an ending, not in the way stories usually do, because something about this journey had already settled into a quieter place, one that didn't require a conclusion, only a deeper kind of noticing. And as I stayed with that awareness, something else began to come into focus, not as a new idea, but as a clearer way of seeing everything that had already unfolded. Because when I look back now at everything this story has revealed, I no longer see separate pieces, the gene, the history, the misunderstanding, the slow return to clarity. They are all part of the same movement, a single process, unfolding over time. And I realized something then, something that felt both simple and quietly complete, that the story of red hair is not really about red hair alone. It is about how humans move from not knowing to knowing, from assumption to understanding, from meaning created out of uncertainty, to clarity grounded in what is actually there. And I began to notice how consistent that process is, not just in this one example, but in many things we encounter, across time, across experience, Something appears, we don't fully understand it, so we explain it using what we already believe, and over time, those explanations become stories, and those stories become the way we see until something shifts, until observation deepens, until knowledge grows, until we begin to see what was always there more clearly, and slowly, those stories begin to fade. Not all at once, but gradually, replaced not by something new, but by something simpler, something closer to what is actually real. And I sat with that for a while, letting it settle because it didn't feel like a theory. It felt like something I had just watched unfold step by step through this entire journey. And I began to understand something more clearly. That misunderstanding is not a failure. It is often the beginning of understanding, a natural part of how we learn, how we make sense of what we don't yet fully see. And the important part is not that misunderstanding exists, but that it can change, that it can soften, that it can be replaced over time by something more accurate, more grounded, more real. And I thought again, quietly, about the role of science in all of this, not as something separate from experience, but as something that gently reveals what is already there, the MC1R gene, the shift in pigment production, the role of environment, of light, of adaptation over generations, all of it, not creating something new, but uncovering what was always present beneath the layers of assumption. And I realized something then, something that felt calm and quietly reassuring. That truth does not always arrive loudly. It doesn't replace everything at once. It emerges slowly, through observation, through patience, through the willingness to keep looking, even after we think we already understand. And I began to see how this changes the way I relate to everything I encounter. Not just this story, but anything that feels unfamiliar, anything that stands out, anything that invites explanation before understanding has fully formed. Because now, there is less urgency to define it immediately, less need to turn it into something complete, before it has had time to reveal itself naturally. And in that, something opens, a quieter way of seeing, a more patient way of understanding. And I sat with that for a while, letting it settle into something deeper than thought, something that didn't need to be held onto, only returned to again and again, in the small moments where perception begins to move ahead of clarity. And slowly, the awareness softened, not fading, but becoming part of something more natural, something that no longer felt separate from the way I see, but part of it. And as that happened, the story itself no longer felt like something I needed to continue, because everything it needed to reveal had already been seen, not in a final answer, but in a way of understanding that continues quietly each time I choose to look again, just a little more clearly than before. I didn't feel the need to bring everything to a final point, not in the way stories usually end, because something about this journey had already settled into a quieter understanding, one that didn't require a conclusion, only a gentle return to what had always been there from the beginning. And as I stayed with that awareness, the story itself began to feel lighter, not because it lost its meaning, but because it no longer needed to carry what was never truly part of it. The fear, the assumptions, the meanings built from uncertainty, all of it, slowly, had fallen away. And what remained was something much simpler. Red hair, a rare expression of the MC1R gene, a variation in pigment, where pheomelanin becomes more present, creating tones that reflect light differently, softer, warmer, a trait that appears more frequently in regions where the environment once shaped the body's need to adapt, where lower sunlight made lighter pigmentation more efficient for vitamin D synthesis. Nothing more, nothing hidden, nothing that needed to be explained beyond what it already is. And I realized something then, something that felt both quiet and complete in its own way, that the mystery was never in the trait itself, it was in the way we tried to understand it, before we truly saw it clearly. And I sat with that for a while, letting it settle, not as a thought, but as something that no longer needed to be thought about at all. Because once something is seen clearly enough, it doesn't need to be held onto. It becomes part of how we see, naturally, without effort. And I began to notice how that changes everything, not in what is there, but in how it is experienced. Because when something is no longer surrounded by assumption, it becomes quieter, simpler, closer to what it has always been, And in that simplicity, something else appears, a kind of stillness, a sense that nothing more needs to be added for it to make sense. And I understood then, not as an idea, but as something directly felt, that this story was never about discovering something extraordinary. It was about removing what made something ordinary seem otherwise. And that realization didn't feel dramatic, it felt calm, almost gentle in the way it settled, because it didn't change the world, it changed the way the world is seen. And I thought again, quietly, about how easily that can happen, how something simple can become something complex when we move too quickly to explain it, and how clarity returns not by adding more, but by seeing what is already there without interruption. And I wondered, softly, without needing an answer, how many things in our lives are waiting in the same way? Not to be changed, but to be seen more clearly. And as that thought settled, there was nothing left to follow. No final question, no conclusion to reach, only this, a quiet understanding that what once felt mysterious was never truly hidden. It was simply there all along, waiting for us to slow down just enough to see it, as it has always been.